It's New Year's Eve. Do you know where your Hall of Fame ballot is? Maybe you don't have one, but I happen to, and it's in the mail just in time. We'll discuss that along with Brandon's pretend Hall of Fame vote just as soon as we all get locked on Twins.
You are Locked On Twins, your daily Minnesota Twins podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Locked On Twins, your daily go-to destination for the top Minnesota Twins insight, discourse, and analysis. Personally, it's my favorite show of the Locked On Podcast Network, which, by the way, brings you your team every day. I'm co-host David Brown, a professional ball writer since 1998, a BBWA member since 2012, and a Baseball Hall of Famer now for the past 2 years. That's two with a capital T. And that's going to be our topic for this episode, the Hall of Fame, with ballots due to be postmarked by December 31st, which is today as we record. And across from me in cyberspace is Brandon Warren. He's a Twins watcher for 30 years. Not long ago, he covered the team on a daily basis professionally, so he knows ball. He asked that you elevate the discourse with him on Twitter at Brandon_Warren, and we're also on Blue Sky. But there's no @ over there. I don't know. If you look for us, we'll wave. He doesn't happen to have a Hall of Fame vote, but he might as well because he knows ball, like I said. And we're going to talk today about, on this podcast, that topic of the Hall of Fame. The votes are due by the writers. There's exactly 400 ballots sent out. Typically, not everybody votes, but almost everybody does who has a ballot. I can't imagine not voting. I mean, I actually can. Maybe that's one of the things we'll talk about. Who I voted for. I voted for 10 people, 10 players. Who I didn't vote for. The whys. And is it wise to have people like us vote for the Hall of Fame? I don't even know. I don't even know who should do it instead of the writers or in addition to the writers. I think there probably should be more people voting for the Hall of Fame, not less. Although I look at some of these votes and I scratch my head. You know, I see somebody go by with Mark Burley on it, but not Andy Pettitte. That doesn't make sense to me. I see somebody not vote for Chase Utley. I'm like, that person didn't do their homework. I get pretty arrogant about it, I would say, because I feel like I do my homework. I don't necessarily make all the right decisions necessarily, but I feel like I study for the test. I'm not sure everybody studies for the test. Brandon, what's your opening salvo here about the Hall of Fame? And it's kind of an open-ended question here, but what do you think of all this nonsense?
Well, I will say one thing that's unrelated. Caleb Thielbar signed with the Cubs today, so that'll be something to monitor.
Cheap Olads.
Yep, cheap.
They wouldn't even make him an offer, I read, according to Darren Wolfson, who knows.
Well, and honestly, I think it was just, listen, we're going to roll with Cody Funder down under and Brent Hedrick and any other lefty you can imagine, maybe Brad Hand on a minor league deal. I don't even know if Brad Hand's still pitching, but they just were ready to move on. And I think last year was a tough one. And even if Caleb comes out and has a nice year for the Cubs, you wish him well, and it's just time to do something different. And so, yeah, there's a very particular troll in Twins Twitter that got real upset about it happening. And you know that same fellow would have been saying, inexcusable to bring him back too. So honestly, it's
like no matter what the news was, they would have reacted with a contrarian opinion.
Yep. But he is now a Cub. Old guy being a Cub. There's some irony for you. No, as far as Hall of Fame stuff, yeah, I mean, I would be delighted to have a vote someday. I don't think my odds are terribly high, but I like the idea that players who represent the history and the game and the history of the game are enshrined there. It's not a holy land necessarily, or a pilgrimage. I don't want to steal from things that are a little more near and dear to people's hearts. But for baseball fans, it is kind of a bucket list. You got to go once to Cooperstown kind of thing. I would say that bucket includes Hall of Fame weekend for me, and I haven't done that yet, and I would like to. But I'll just get out in front of it. I'm a big Hall guy, not come one, come all, you're all going to get into the hall, but I definitely don't need a player to have been the very best player in the AL or NL for a period of time. If a player was one of the best at their position for an extended period of time, or, the Sandy Koufax rule where if you dominated for a short stretch and then other things caused the end of your career, that's definitely part of my consideration. And you'll see that in today's episode. But I do get upset with certain aspects of it. I'm as ardent of a defender as anybody who had a vote would be, I would imagine, because of how badly I would like to have a vote, I would want people to take it seriously because it is such an exclusive club. And I'm sure that's not something that's lost on you.
No, I think that's approximately how I feel about it. I think for the most part, the writers through the years have done a solid job with the Hall of Fame. I think there are, if you want to complain about the quality of the players being watered down, you got to go back to like the 40s when there were veterans committees that had ex-players on it that basically elected a bunch of their cronies. And it's been written about kind of extensively through the years, a bunch of guys who don't necessarily measure up statistically. And I look at stats a lot, the context of them. That's, I don't know if it's 90% or 99%, but that's, I compare how the players did to people of their peers, the people they played against, and also the historically speaking. But you've also, it's tricky. There's a lot of nuance involved. Hitting 40 home runs in 1999 isn't the same as hitting 40 home runs in 2013. And, the same goes for the 1930s. There was a very lively ball in the wake of Babe Ruth becoming popular. Everybody wanted to have a bunch of Babe Ruths running around, so they livened up the ball. And there's all kinds of issues like that. There's PEDs, there's lively balls, there's dead balls, there's raised mounds. All that stuff goes into figuring out who belongs in the Hall of Fame. So some of it gets pretty tedious, the conversations and even the thinking about it. And I'm glad it's over because it feels like I've studied for a test and I've taken the test, and now whatever grade happens, and it's kind of out of my hands at this point. But I will be monitoring Ryan Thibodeau's ballot tracker to see how all the candidates are doing. So it's something to do also in between baseball seasons.
How much does your studying from one year to the next affect? I mean, granted, let's say Ichiro is a first-year player on the ballot. CC Sabathia is. But when you're reconsidering the case of, let's say, Andy Pettitte, how much does your look into his career change year over year? And I suspect maybe, if it was someone you didn't choose before and choose now, that would probably be a good thing for you to address. Like, is there a method to your madness, or is it kind of, look, the ballot is stacked a certain way, and so I know I have very few spots for non-shoe-ins, and like, for instance, that's how I did it. I did cross out the guys that I know I would never vote for. Right. Then I did the guys I'm for sure voting for, and then the ether. I have guys highlighted in pink who I voted for, and then highlighted in like a yellow of, in an unlimited ballot, I would vote for these players. How do you kind of research year over year and then arrange your thoughts?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's not necessarily the same way. It hasn't been the same way this year that it was in other years. Like with people like Pettitte, I probably did most of the heavy lifting before last year, before my first ballot,
right?
For guys who are returning, I sort of get that mentally out of the way. Well, I sort of have a place in history in my mind for him, and I didn't think he was worthy last year, just using Andy Pettitte as an example, and I still don't. But I wish, we only get 10 people that we're allowed to vote for. That's one of the rules, and I think that is a bad rule. I think you should, they already kind of cut off at a certain point the players that you can vote for. There's 28 guys we can vote for. When the committees start out figuring out how to put a ballot together, there's way more than that. I don't know if there's 50 or 75 or whatever. Then they make cuts.
Are you discouraged from saying anything negative like I don't like the process?
I think they discourage us. They do it in ways of omission and commission. They discourage us from telling everybody who we voted for until the election's over. They don't really like that. Other than that, there's no that I've noticed any pushback. And maybe I just don't hang out with the right writers or whatever. But I've never, I don't. Lots of people complain about the process. And I say that in a good way, like they want to make it better. The only thing that they really remember, it came up a few years ago that some people like sell their vote to somebody else, and it actually wasn't like expressly forbidden that you do this. I think Dan Lebitard was somebody who said, I'm giving my vote. I don't know if he sold it, but he's like, I'm giving my vote to another person. They don't like that.
Right.
They want the person in the Baseball Writers Association to actually do the voting. So that's one thing that they don't allow. But they don't, as far as criticism, I think it is more than 99% allowed. I mean, if I went around saying, all the hierarchy at the BBWA is this and that, and I called them names and that kind of thing, for all I know, I'd get thrown out. But nobody really does that. So there's a line somewhere, and I'm not anywhere close to it as far as being critical of them. So they let me say what I want, which I think is the right thing to do. So, hey, I thought maybe I would have done a reveal already. We'll do that after our break. Let's break for the first time, and I'll tell everybody who I voted for, and then you can tell people who you'd vote for, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? Because that definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps you lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year or in the new year. We're coming up on some resolutions, but Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year using all of the app's premium features. So if it's a streaming service, if you're paying for music, it's to find things that you didn't even know you were still doing. You got that radio out in the car, all that fun stuff. If you're still paying for it and you don't want to be, Rocket Money will find them and they'll help cancel them for you. And they'll also help you just renegotiate cheaper rates too. Highly, highly recommended. For me, though, that subscription tracker was huge. Plus, with their goals feature, I was able to automatically set aside money for my future. No more stressing about budgeting every month. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon.
So I've got a Hall of Fame vote. If you've been in the Baseball Writers Association for at least 10 years, you're supposed to have one. And I've been in since 2012. This is my second vote. And I've already sent the vote in. I've made an announcement on Twitter. I've contacted the vote tracker, the unofficial official vote tracker, Ryan Thibodeau, and told him that I am voting for Bobby Abreu, Carlos Beltran, Russell Martin, Dustin Pedroia, Alex Rodriguez, CC Sabathia, Ichiro Suzuki, Chase Utley, Billy Wagner, and David Wright. So those are my 10. Now, if you are associated with PEDs, I will not necessarily dismiss your vote. There's some people who won't vote for A-Rod because he failed a drug test and lied about biogenesis and got caught a couple times and made a bunch of denials and broke the rules, as A-Rod himself has said. I won't necessarily hold that against a player as far as the Hall of Fame goes, and not voting for them because of the Hall of Fame. So that's kind of my rule there. I will, however, there are players on the list here who had Hall of Fame careers that I didn't vote for because of an arrest for domestic violence, for example. Something that heinous. There is a clause in the rules that says you can. It says you can vote for whoever you want, but there's also something in there about character. And I don't think when they put the character clause in years ago that they were thinking about domestic violence. Honestly, I think the writers have been voting on this since the 30s or whatever, and I don't think people cared about domestic violence in the 30s. I'm not deluding myself there. I don't think that's necessarily what that clause was for, but it's there, and I use it to say no to Andrew Jones. Manny Ramirez was arrested for domestic violence. Omar Vizquel. I don't think Omar Vizquel has a Hall of Fame career. I think he falls on the other side, but if he did, I wouldn't vote for him anyway. And K-Rod. Francisco Rodriguez. I think he falls down the list of relievers. I wouldn't have voted for him even if he wasn't on the record a couple times with domestic violence issues. So, yeah, I mean, some people probably don't even remember Manny, but because he's kind of a jovial sort, but he's on the list, and he has made a couple of he's what's the phrase? What's a nice phrase that's not insulting to people who he's found God, and he's probably a better person than he was 10 years ago. But at this time, I'm not moved to vote for him. Andrew Jones hasn't really apologized at all for his. It was alleged that he dragged his wife down the stairs by her hair on Christmas Day, 2011, 2012, something like that. I'm not going to vote for him either. If somebody else wants to vote for Andrew Jones because he's perhaps the greatest defensive outfielder of all time, you go ahead. You put him in the Hall of Fame. I'm not contributing to throwing a party for that guy. So that's basically how I feel about that. What about you, Brandon? What guys would you vote for on this list?
Well, and the added votes for Omar Vizquel at this point is inexplicable, inexcusable. I mean, if you didn't think Omar Vizquel was a Hall of Famer before, and you've had, I mean, how many years has he been on the ballot? It's quite a few. In the last year, multiple years, all that we found out about him is dreadful, terrible, awful stuff. So for him to be gaining votes at this time, you have to actively be either avoiding what has been coming out, or honestly, I don't know what else. And so
8th year on the ballot for Vizquel.
So he's got 2 years left. Unless he were to somehow get 5% off, that's not going to happen because he has enough of a ring of support. But as soon as I see Omar Vizquel on a ballot, 1 year pricks up. As soon as I hear added this year, I'm just like, all right, I don't even need to see this ballot because this is an unserious person. As far as the application of the character clause for me, what I struggle with is because, and part of the rule of having a BBWA membership and then being there for 10 years is to get to know some of these guys maybe on more of a level than I have right now. Now, I mean, I know Torrey Hunter a little bit, and beyond that, I didn't really cover any of these guys in person. I mean, I'd be more likely to see Alex Rodriguez than any of these other guys just because of his current relationship with the Timberwolves. So there are some certain aspects of the character clause that I couldn't apply that I think is, how it may have been intended, as far as like, how did they treat teammates? How did they treat fans? How did they treat media? I couldn't apply that. And that's why, I mean, for one, I don't have a ballot, so this is all hypothetical. But two, if there's any way that I feel like I would be applying it in some ways and not others, like I'm not super comfortable with being that level of judge and jury. So I do have Andrew Jones on mine, and it's not that I don't think what he did was terrible. It's just that if I can't apply that uniformly to everyone, and feel like I'm doing that the way I need to, then I kind of just have to really go down the road of, were they a Hall of Fame player? And then, if they were to have, hit someone with their car and killed them and been imprisoned, like that to me would be obviously something where you would disqualify someone, and everything beneath like that is so hard for me to judge on because I just don't know enough. I mean, I don't want to sound like a cop out. I mean, Vizquel stuff, he wasn't a Hall of Famer for me anyway, but we just keep hearing more and more and more details. And the more that comes out, the more I'm just like, get him out of here. So I realize that's a flimsy reasoning, but it's really, I just don't feel like I could necessarily apply it uniformly to, things that happened recently, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so I just kind of, I don't want to say stay in my lane, but just stay in my comfort zone of what did they do on the field? And so with that said, my pink highlights or my yes, and there's 10 of them, Bobby Abreu, Carlos Beltran, Andrew Jones, Andy Pettit, Manny Ramirez, Alex Rodriguez, CC Sabathia, Ichiro Suzuki, Chase Utley, and Billy Wagner. Now, on an unlimited ballot, because like I said, I am a large haul, big haul person, I would also vote for Mark Burley, Felix Hernandez, Russell Martin, Brian McCann, Dustin Pedroia, and David Wright. Now, I couldn't say 100% on all of those, but I feel pretty confident that all of those guys, if I had an unlimited ballot, would get my vote. Now, I realize the logistics of 16 guys making the Hall of Fame and giving their speeches all at once would probably be a little crazy. And so I get why there isn't more players. You can't vote for more, but if I'm telling the story of that era, I feel like I need those guys for one reason or another. If you can vote for Dustin Pedroia, I don't feel like you can not vote for David Wright. If you voted for Joe Mauer, you really have to look hard at Russell Martin and Brian McCann. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to vote for them, but you have to look at them. Andy Pettit was a big game pitcher and had a better career than Mark Burley, but I think Mark Burley and what he meant to the White Sox and just kind of his career, like he'd probably be on the tail end of pitchers I would acknowledge. And then Felix Hernandez, I mean, it's not exactly Sandy Koufax, but he was pretty much finished at 29 and still was over a 50 Fangraphs WAR pitcher. That to me, his peak is exactly what you look for from a Hall of Fame starting pitcher. And I'm not going to disqualify him because his arm broke down or whatever reason. Some guys like him or Tim Lincecum hit that 30-year, age 30 slump and then don't come back from it. Some guys like Justin Verlander do. And so I think you have to judge each of them individually on how their careers went. And for me, Felix would probably be my first guy in if I had to eliminate one of my 10. But then there is a lot of logic of, how do you pick Martin but not McCann, Pedroia, not Wright. I feel comfortable with the 10 I've chosen on their baseball acumen. But again, like you said, applying the character clause makes it tricky.
Yeah, it can be tricky. There's and even beyond the character clause, there's I think there's different ways to show that you're a Hall of Famer. I don't think it's all the same way. I mean, the ultimate example of that would be like Sandy Koufax, who burned really hot for 5 or 6 years and was clearly a great player. But early in his career, he was wild. Late in his career, it didn't exist really because he didn't pitch after 30 because he had, they didn't have the same kind of medical advancements they did now. And he was in pain. And he's like, I don't need this. I can do whatever Sandy's done since then. I know he's worked with the Dodgers sometimes in spring training. But so, yeah, you mentioned Felix Hernandez. He's probably my first guy. If I was able to vote for 11, he'd be the 11th guy.
Yep.
And I wasn't really sure if leaving him off was the right thing to do. I've got a couple guys who I feel similarly to. You mentioned David Wright. David Wright had a career at third base that's a lot like Felix Hernandez's as a pitcher.
Or Joe Mauer.
And Joe Mauer, similar to. Joe Mauer played, but he was in a different position and
diminished.
Yep. Yeah. So I understand that there might be some contradictions, but I think there's enough in common with some of the other players that I voted for that it makes sense. David Wright was, a 7-time All-Star, and I think there were 2 players over his first 7 or 8 years that had accumulated more WAR than he did. If you look at FanGraphs, but only a couple. So I mean, he's one of the best hitters, certainly at his position, and even lately among all positions since he came into the league. So he's got a lot going for him. His career was short. He had something like 100 at bats after age 31, so his career didn't go very long. But Dustin Pedroia, similarly, Pedroia compares a little more favorably against second basemen who are in the Hall of Fame than Wright does, if you look at the bulk of their careers.
Yeah.
So
it's a weird position, second base. It just is. I mean, it's so weird that Ian Kinsler's on the ballot and you can't immediately disqualify him.
No, you can't. You can't. I think there were 28 players on the ballot, and there were 20 that I really looked hard at. And that doesn't include the guys who I dismissed out of hand because of domestic violence issues. So
right.
It's a pretty stacked ballot. I think you could make an argument for a lot of guys. I don't even necessarily begrudge people. It's pretty clear that with PEDs in the picture, Alex Rodriguez was one of the 15 or 16 best players, 15 or 20 best players ever. If you want to take some away from that, some off that because of PEDs, it makes sense. If you want to not vote for him because it is what he did was cheating, I respect that too. There's a lot of players, and I think part of my being informed about this comes also from talking to players about this. Not necessarily, well, did you think A-Rod was a Hall of Famer? But what do you think of steroid cheaters? And I think A-Rod would have been a great player anyway if no one had ever figured out PEDs. And that's kind of how my logic with it. But I see people dismissing him and saying, I'm not voting for that guy because he broke the rules, because he cheated. And even A-Rod, there was an interview that he did with Cigar Aficionado magazine, of all things, about 6 years ago.
Like he's getting your airport seat back.
Yes, exactly. Where he said, there were rules and I broke them and I have to live with the consequences. That's the short version of it. I don't think anybody's ever put it better than that. And it's funny that it comes from A-Rod himself. So I understand where people come from on that. I forgive him for lack of a better phrase, and I think he was a great player anyway. And I think it's different. For example, what he did versus what Pete Rose did versus what like the 1919 White Sox did. The 1919 White Sox took money to lose the World Series on purpose. Pete Rose bet on his own games as a player and a manager, which means there was something going on in those games that was influencing the outcome other than Pete Rose's best effort as a player or a manager.
Right.
That's why not even getting into the things that Pete Rose did off the field that lesser influential people would have been arrested for, but the things that he did within baseball as a manager and as a player, and you can look this up, completely heinous. Compromise the sport. He's not ever been accused of throwing a game on purpose. Right. But when you are a regular bettor of games and you're in those games and you don't, for example, bet on a certain game, what do you think that looks like to the other gamblers?
It's a sin of omission versus commission.
Yes. It's like, well, Pete didn't think that the Reds, he didn't bet on the Reds today, so he must know something. It's a dirty business. And anybody who played baseball, especially professionally, should be upset at him for what he did to mess up the sport. I mean, we talk about all the great people just wax poetically about Pete Rose and the history of the game and being the all-time hits leader and Charlie Hustle. All of that is erased and reversed by the craziness and the illegal things and against the rules things that he did as a player to manager. There's no question about it. This isn't some political agenda against him or a personality clash. This guy did more to ruin the game of baseball than anybody in history. Pete Rose did.
He ruined lives. Ray Fosse, he ruined the pitchers he abused. He ruined lives off the field, no doubt about it. I don't even have a second thought when someone says, "Oh, there's all this legal betting now on the screen." Doesn't matter to me. Players still are not betting, and if they are, they're going
not
to be
supposed to. They're certainly
right.
not supposed to.
There's
and we can talk about how wise it is to have these associations. I think that's certainly a worthy conversation.
A whole nother dissertation. Well, and there's a saying going around online that's, I bet this hits really hard if you're stupid. And I when someone says, put Pete Rose in now that gambling's in baseball, I'm like, yeah, I bet that hits pretty hard if you're stupid, because that's a very terrible logical conclusion to draw. That's not smart at all.
Let me address a couple other things, a couple other players on the ballot who I voted for. Russell Martin. A year ago, before I started to look ahead to this season, that's a player I wouldn't necessarily have said, "Oh, I'm going to vote for him for the Hall of Fame." When the games are going on, did this player strike you as a Hall of Famer as they were playing? And I can't say that Russell Martin did. Now, he was a very good player. Mm-hmm. I knew he had a good reputation on defense, and he was a better hitter as a catcher than most catchers. But still, there's probably two guys, Rick Farrell and Ray Schalk, in the Hall of Fame, who were worse hitters than Russell Martin. If we're talking about if Russell Martin is a Hall of Famer. So he's on the low end there. But where Russell Martin has made a contribution is being a great pitch framer. And pitch framing is something that teams pay for in real life. They put money into. It's important. Even the supposed best defensive catcher of his generation, Yadier Molina, it took him a while. Early in his career, he was not very good at pitch framing, but he worked at it and ended up being an excellent pitch framer into his 30s. So, but in the meantime, Russell Martin, a better hitter than Yadier Molina, basically on average, did enough. He's 11th all time at FanGraphs, which accounts for defense better than Baseball Reference's WAR does.
Yep.
11th all time in WAR among catchers, among every catcher who's ever played.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can't really measure how good Johnny Bench or Yogi Berra were at pitch framing, but we can measure Martin against his contemporaries, even like Piazza and Molina and Joe Mauer, who's gotten in, and Buster Posey, who's on the verge, and Brian McCann, who's another candidate. And he rates very well. Would Russell Martin be one of the in the top third of the catchers in the Hall of Fame? No. Is he like 50-50 guy like Chase Utley, who is as good as half the guys above and below at second base? No. Is he better than the bottom third of the catchers in the Hall of Fame with pitch framing? I say yes.
Yeah.
I don't think he's not. We monitor Ryan Thibodeau's vote tracker. He's not doing great as far as you need 5% of the vote, which is 10% would be
40 votes.
40 votes. So you needed like 20, 25 votes, depending on how many people vote.
Yeah.
To get into to make it to next season and keep the conversation going. I don't know that he's going to make it. I'm not sure that McCann will. I'd like to have a chance to vote for McCann in the future. I don't think McCann's pitch framing was as good as Martin's. He was a better hitter, but not better enough to make up for the gulf on defense.
It's very Kenny Lofton-esque kind of player, though. Like the player who could get 5% off, but you could definitely make a case for them deserving not only to not be 5%, but to be inducted.
Absolutely. Kenny Lofton compares pretty well at center field. There's a lot of guys who, he's sort of Utley-like, where, half the center fielders in history are better in the Hall of Fame. I mean, and half of them are worse. He's kind of a middle of the road Hall of Famer, which I think is that's a safe way to vote.
Yeah.
you mentioned how ball players don't necessarily have to be the absolute best at their position. Like the next guy you put in the Hall of Fame should be better than the best guy who's in there already. That's not realistic. We're never going to, we're hardly ever going to elect anybody if we do it like that. But someone like Martin, I think, is better than most. And also, by voting for him, I don't think I'm keeping anybody out of the Hall of Fame,
right,
who deserves it. Felix Hernandez is doing pretty well as far as that 5% thing. He's probably going to be on the ballot. He's not safe yet, but he's got enough votes. It's tracking that way that he'll be on the ballot next year and he'll get another chance for people to vote for him. So I don't think that's one thing I wanted to make sure with my votes, that I wasn't keeping anybody out who absolutely deserved it. So I wanted to say that about Martin before, because he's probably the most controversial of any of my picks.
No, I think that that I agree with all of that, and I mean, I see why they don't want to expand the voting, like, to where you could vote for more, and that's why my theory is, if you vote yes on a player once, they stay yes, and you don't have to vote for them in subsequent years, so that you don't use a vote on them the next time around. And everybody says, "Oh, that'd be a nightmare to track." Well, like if you next year said, "All right, I am explicitly a no on Russell Martin now," after I was a yes last year, he comes off your slate. That I would have no problem with that. And honestly, I don't think it would be all that difficult to track. But I don't know. That's to me a happy medium, because I know they want it to be an exclusive honor to get in. But with that said, if they trust the electorate, but not enough to not pick too many players to dilute the process, why are they the electorate in the first place? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think they definitely have. There's some things that they are safeguarding against that I don't know why they're necessarily safeguarding against them. I think there's been a lot of voters who said, "Yeah, I'd vote for 15 or 20." There have been years where I didn't have a vote yet. And I'm like, well, if I did, like, especially when they had the log jams with people overloading, the ballots because they wouldn't vote for a guy because of the taint of PEDs.
Clemens and that, yeah.
Yes.
5-6 years ago.
They were worried about, like, everybody voting for 20 guys, and then sometime in the future having a dais where there's like 15 or 20 Hall of Famers in a ceremony that lasts 3 days. I think that's where they were coming from. But the organization as a whole has generally been so conservative about adding new Hall of Famers. If they just look at the history, I know it's different people voting, not necessarily every year, but in terms of just kind of the rolling average of it, it's not always the same 400 people. And certainly not when you look at 5 years go by, 10 years go by. That's just not going to happen. The body is not going to elect. This is not a veterans committee from 1945 that's going to, let's put all our friends in the Hall of Fame, which was basically what they were doing. Old Giants and old Cardinals. So I don't think there's anything really that they're guarding against here that is a fair boogeyman, if you will. So I don't like that. We want to look ahead before we go to what the ballot is going to look like next year. And we don't know who's going to get in and who isn't. It's looking like the close ones. Beltran, I don't think he's going to quite get there. I think some people are holding he's a pretty clear Hall of Famer to me, but he's also got the taint of what happened with the Astros in 2017. He helped orchestrate the high tech and low tech cheating scandal where they used surveillance equipment and trash cans to try and see what pitches were coming and communicate that. And he was part of it, cost him the Mets job. And I think people are not voting for him. It's less this year and less as time has gone on. I think it's his third year on the ballot. I think Beltran will get there eventually. I don't think he's going to get there this year just because of previous voting trends and how, the public ballots that we know about now versus the people who vote later, they're going to be more conservative. They usually are. So I think Beltran is going to have to wait until at least next year. I think Andrew Jones in a similar position. I don't think that he'll make it either. So I think CC's looking good. He doesn't have 100%, but I think CC Sabathia will get over 75%. I think Billy Wagner will. He's at 84, so it's going to be close. There's a decent sample right now out there, and it's not 400 votes, but it's about a quarter or so of that. He's looking okay. Ichiro, everybody that has turned in a ballot so far that we know about has voted for Ichiro. He's at 100%. It's possible he might be the first position player to achieve 100% at the end, which I think is good. It's a nuance too with Ichiro because he didn't come into the major leagues until overseas, not to diminish Japan, but until he was 27 years old, and he still got 3,000 hits and 500 stolen bases, something like, and is 60 WAR, and he's as far as WAR goes, he's probably close to the middle, maybe a little higher in terms of all the left fielder, or he's a right fielder in terms of all the right fielders in history. But I think he's undeniably a Hall of Famer, and it's good that people are seeing that and they're not holding against him that he's from Japan, which I think I kind of thought at one point maybe they would, but it doesn't seem like they are.
Yeah, no, I'm most eager to see what his speech is like because I always go back to his interview with Bob Costas and the Kansas City thing. And if people haven't seen that, just look up Ichiro favorite American expression. And if Bob Costas is in the video, you've found the right one.
It's one of the funniest things ever. It's funny too because it's he lets this guard down. I mean, he seems like a very intense dude about training and trying to be private and baseball and business only kind of a guy. But there's a dark, in a good way, side to Ichiro, a very funny side.
One of my favorite Ichiro stories is when Torrey Hunter robbed Barry Bonds in Milwaukee. Was that 03?
02, I think.
02? Torrey said Ichiro said some words that he didn't know Ichiro even knew. Like Torrey's like, man, you should have heard Ichiro. He's like, holy blankety blank blank blank, and he's like, I didn't even know Ichiro knew those words.
Well, one of the biggest victims, and I use that word very loosely, of interleague play turned out to be Ichiro because Ichiro was like the most pro AL guy ever when it came to the All-Star game. He was a guy that he'd go to the games and he'd basically give the rah-rah speech every year. And that's part of what Torrey Hunter's talking about, not just when he made that play, but beforehand in the clubhouse. I don't know if Ichiro did it that year because he was still relatively new to the league, but like his clubhouse speeches, his motivational speeches to the American League squad before the All-Star game, I don't think anybody's ever taped it or whatever.
But they're legend of legend.
Yes. So that's just I think that's a fun and relatively healthy way to show what kind of competitor you are.
Yep.
And I went to spring training a few years ago when I was working for Bally Sports, and I saw Ichiro taking fly balls at Mariners camp in full uniform. I mean, he had retired already, but it didn't look like it. It looked like he wasn't sure. Like maybe he was coming back. So he's still. I mean, that's a guy who loves competing, loves baseball. How can you not love that?
Exactly.
That's something we can all identify with. I hear he's a big Star Wars fan too, but I've never talked to him about that. So I don't know for sure. But But I guess we could look at one more thing. Next year, who's coming to the ballot that might get a vote to complicate matters? So we don't know exactly who's going to be on the ballot and who's off. I think Billy Wagner will make it, I think. And we mentioned Ichiro and CC. I think they'll be on it. The two here are the 2026 eligibles according to the Hall of Fame website. This is not like a list of players who are on the ballot for sure, but only are likely to be. Ryan Braun, Shin-Soo Choo, Edwin Encarnacion, Gio Gonzalez, Alex Gordon, Cole Hamels, Matt Kemp, Howie Kendrick, Nick Markakis, Daniel Murphy, Hunter Pence, Rick Porcello, and Neil Walker. I see two guys on that list. Hamels as a possibility. He had a CC Sabathia-ish kind of career. I don't think it was as good, but there's been a dearth of pitchers added to the Hall of Fame in recent years skipped over a bunch of guys I think deserve it. Rick Russell, Kevin Brown, just to name a couple. Kevin Brown has an association with PEDs, so maybe that's it. But Ryan Braun, surprisingly, even though he doesn't have like a lot of career statistics, he doesn't have 400 home runs and so forth. But if you look at the average WAR of a left fielder in the Hall of Fame, it's kind of low. It's like 53. And if you look at that from a right fielder, I think it's like 59. Maybe even a little higher than that. So there's a lower bar. And I don't know if Ryan Braun's definitely got an association with PEDs. That's probably going to keep him out.
Yep.
As it has with like Manny Ramirez and A-Rod and other people. Ivan Rodriguez, there was I think he was in the Mitchell report.
Yep.
That didn't seem to bother people very much, but voters, they overlooked that. But Ryan Braun and Cole Hamels are guys who are going to get votes, and they're going to get attention from me. I don't think any of these other new guys that I mentioned, I'm going to look, but at first blush, it doesn't seem it to me like they're going to. But Ryan Braun and Cole Hamels are definitely going to be on my radar when I do this again next year, Lord willing.
Yeah, I think that I'd probably disqualify Braun, but have to look into it more just because of the tester and smearing that person and stuff. I'd have to look into more of that. But
the delivery guy / tester.
Yep.
I forget his name at this point, but that was kind of an ugly moment. But that's going to do it for this Hall of Fame ballot episode of Locked On Twins. So for Brandon Warren, this is Dave Brown wishing you all a very pleasant good evening. And the next time we talk, it'll be probably a little more Twins based. I don't think Torrey Hunter is going to be on that ballot next year. I don't think he's going to get enough votes. So, Torrey, it was nice while it lasted. But that's Brandon. I'm Dave. And we are going to Alexei Casilla
tomorrow night.
Tomorrow night.